Welcome to Am I Famous Yet? Memoir of a Working Class Rock Star. This is chapter 13 called What's Your Worst Nightmare? I would venture to guess that the majority of people very wisely choose not to participate as performing artists because they correctly fear public embarrassment. Breaking wind loudly on a crowded train car is bad enough, but imagine standing in front of 1,000 people who are all pointing at you and laughing or booing. Almost everyone has had some version of that nightmare, haven't they? As a performer, no matter how much you have rehearsed, no matter how carefully you have prepared, no matter how expert you are at that special thing that you do, occasionally things are not going to go well. A light bulb could burn out, the microphone wire could suddenly stop working, a drunken heckler could disrupt the performance. There are so many forces beyond our control that can derail the mood of an entire room full of people. Inevitably, there will come a time when there will be public embarrassment. Occasionally, it can be epic public shame. If you're the type of person for whom this is absolutely terrifying, perhaps a career in the performing arts isn't your wisest choice. On the other hand, one of the things that makes a live performance exciting is the very possibility that something could go wrong. This is one of the attractions of watching a NASCAR race. Not that someone can drive flawlessly at 200 miles an hour for 500 miles, but the fact that one of them could crash at any moment. This metaphor gets used verbatim in Broadway orchestra pits. If a first-time substitute player comes in and doesn't play well enough to get asked to make a return engagement, this is called a crash and burn. I've personally witnessed this happening 2 different times. Both times it was very upsetting to everyone in the room. I have heard playing in a Broadway pit for a long run described as hours and hours of total boredom interspersed with brief flashes of white-hot panic. It's the nature of the beast. Performing the exact same songs over and over again takes a lot of skill. It also requires intense concentration, probably more so on the 100th performance than on the 10th. Your mind just starts to inevitably drift. As a substitute musician, I've played close to 500 performances of 12 different Broadway shows. I've never officially held a chair as a full-time orchestra member, but I've put in some time over to the Broadway. I've seen performances go spectacularly well. I've also seen a few go much less spectacularly. I was subbing one time in the pit of a show that I will simply call the most expensive and most infamous show in Broadway history without naming any names. This is to protect the guilty. I played about 45 performances at this superhero musical. There I've said too much. The beginning of the second song of the show started with just the bass, played by me this evening, and the drums in an exposed moment. The bass was going through an effects pedal board that was supposed to make the bass sound like huge and a little cartoonish. Imagine singing in a basso profundo voice, boom, wah, 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 wah. That was how it was supposed to sound, big and menacing. Now, factor in the fact that the show had been running for 2 years by this time. The equipment that was being used for 8 shows every week for over 100 weeks was starting to show its age. Somehow the effects pedal board had developed a hair trigger and in all of that pounding so that the volume pedal, which the bass player had to ride for the whole show, could now suddenly switch itself into a different mode function. Instead of a volume pedal, it might without warning turn into a wah-wah or a pitch shifter pedal. This was what happened to me. Instead of the basso profundo sound, the effects unit had now transposed the bass up 2 whole octaves. It sounded like a drunken hummingbird barking at its highest register. Bing! This sound wasn't computing in my head because I'd never heard a bass guitar make any noise in that register before. I didn't even know it was possible. I just kept thinking, I don't know who's making that ridiculous sound, but I know it can't be me. One by one, everyone's head in the orchestra room started to look at me with that head-tilted, confused Scooby-Doo look until I realized that somehow it was indeed me making that awful sound at this very exposed and inopportune moment in the show. Now the panic started to set in. I started scrambling for a setting that sounded anything like a bass and nothing like a piccolo on crack. I needed something that resembled a bass, even if it wasn't the exact tone that everyone was used to hearing in that spot. I found one soon enough and spent the rest of the performance on high alert in case the pedal board decided to throw me any more curveballs. Mercifully, it did not. Also, mercifully, the gaffe was rightly blamed on the equipment and not me as a player. All was forgiven by the conductor. Another evening at the same theater, a first-time sub came in on the Guitar 1 chair. There were 3 guitars in that pit. Guitar 1 tended to do more of the exposed parts and lead lines. While all of the guitars are important chairs, Guitar 1 had a lot more to do out in the open. There was less opportunity to hide if something went wrong. That particular evening, the guitar player was just too inexperienced in general and underprepared specifically to play that particular book properly. Unfortunately, this deficit was not small on either count. It did not go well. It was apparent to us in the orchestra almost immediately that something was amiss. It was also apparent to the guitar player as well, who, realizing he was screwing up, then proceeded to do what we all do and let nerves get the better of him. Mistakes get compounded in a situation like that. A lot of stupid errors get made that would never happen when just practicing the same music in the safety and comfort of your own home. As the first act was progressing, the tension in the room was mounting steadily. The conductor, who was also a substitute that night, just kept his head down and didn't make eye contact with anyone. We all knew this kid was fired by the time we got to the intermission, but we still had the second act yet to play. There was no choice. They needed someone to remain sitting in that chair, no matter how disastrously, for the last hour of the show. I found myself looking ahead in my score to try to figure out which cues I had to play together with the unfortunate guitarist so that I could steel myself. I wanted to be prepared to play as if the dude weren't even in the room. By intermission, the stage manager had called down to the conductor in the pit to confirm that there was indeed a guitar sub player on that night instead of the regular dude. It had been noticed upstairs. This was extremely not good. The dude's career at that show opened and closed on the same night. There's a constant state of fear for our jobs that all Broadway pit subs live under. There's a long line of people waiting for those chairs. We have to play better than the person that we're subbing for, while at the same time trying to do our best impersonation to sound exactly like them so that the actors aren't able to notice when a difference when the sub is in. Mistakes are frowned upon in general, though there is the understanding that they do happen in live theater. A mistake made by someone who holds a chair on a show will be laughed at by the other orchestra members. That same exact mistake made by a sub will prompt all the other orchestra members to say, I don't know if this guy's going to work out or not. It's a tough racket. This brings me to probably my greatest moment of potential embarrassment on any stage. I was subbing on the Broadway musical Hedwig and the Angry Inch. It was an onstage role in full costume and makeup. There was a little choreography, the music had to be memorized as well as a couple of lines, and a bunch of stage business. I was playing bass, singing background for the entire show with even 2 different lead vocal spots, playing keyboard bass in a few spots, and playing acoustic guitar on one song. It was a fair amount of heavy lifting, to be sure. As a sub on that show, I got the luxury of sitting in at a put-in rehearsal for one of the actors. I had a dry run before going on in front of an audience, but this was unusual. Usually one has to learn the book in the privacy of one's home and just show up and nail it at a performance in front of an audience who have paid a lot of money for their seats. As I said, mistakes are frowned upon. It's very likely that the one performance opportunity they've given you as a first-time sub could potentially be your one and only performance. It can take upwards of a month just to prepare for this first show. Compound this with the fact that all of the regular orchestra members are usually bored silly. They're doing crossword puzzles or checking their phones every moment that they're not actually playing a song. They have also been through hell to get where they are, not unlike pledges to a fraternity who have had to endure. There's a persistent sensation that the other orchestra members actually want you to fail. Seeing someone else fail gives them a war story to tell, and it confirms their feeling that they are somehow members of an elite class of performers. And they are, except that they're also not really. They put on their pants like one at a time, just like everybody else. It's just that they practice putting on their pants over and over again until they're really good at it. The vibe in the theater at Hedwig wasn't like this at all. Everyone was super nice and completely supportive. They all wanted you to do well because you made them look good. This was as it should be, yet unfortunately an unusual situation for most Broadway shows. Even so, as a first-time sub on a Broadway show, you still have to basically wear a diaper. It's just that tense. My first performance at Hedwig went amazingly well. I had 1,000 things in my head that I was trying to remember: the bass lines, the vocal parts, the lyrics, my stage business, choreography, and on and on. It went well. I was nervous, but hit all of my marks with sufficient competency. Late in the show, there was a choreographed mosh pit scene. While wearing sunglasses on a darkened stage lit only with a strobe light, I was told to hit a tiny mark on the floor with my back facing the character Yitzhak, played by Lena Hall, who had just won a Tony Award for the role. Lena was to come barreling into my back at full speed 2 different times, knocking me forward and apparently off balance. I think Lena weighs about 90 pounds soaking wet, But I was in the proper position to take my beating anyway. This all happened exactly as intended. So far, so good. At the end of the show, after we played the music for the bows, my instructions were to put down the bass and join the cast and band up on a riser for a final group bow. Simple enough. What I didn't realize was that during the mosh pit scene, somehow the metal chain necklace that I was wearing had gotten wrapped around a button on my leather jacket. This entanglement took place over the top of the guitar strap, effectively physically locking the bass onto my body. The bass was literally fastened onto my costume. It was also plugged into the stage rig. I was trapped in that spot, unable to complete the final duty I had for the evening, which was to simply walk up and take a bow. The music was already over. 1,000 people were on their feet giving us a standing ovation. The show, the hard part, was over. All I needed to do was simply bow and go home. I started tearing at the necklace chain. It clearly wasn't going to be moved. So I tried to take the strap off the bass to release myself that way. As I began frantically pulling at the bass strap, it got tangled in the cable connected to my in-ear headphones, in the necklace chain, and even now in my long hair. The more frantically I pulled at it, the tighter the knot it made. The cast was looking at me. The 1,000 people in the audience were looking at me, and I was digging myself a deeper and deeper hole. The music director, Justin, finally just said to me, "Just bring the bass," which I did. The guitar cable was just long enough to reach where the cast was standing and waiting patiently for me to take their final bow. Justin took mercy upon my soul and reached over to unplug the bass. He tossed the cable aside so that I could at least now exit the stage in my shame. That had never occurred to me. I was trying to follow orders and put the bass down. The bass proved impossible to put down for what Justin later described as an uncomfortably long period of time. It was probably only 20 to 30 seconds, but that's a long time to be on a Broadway stage in front of that many people visibly and comically screwing up. The cast always did a post-show huddle every night. That night, the star, John Cameron Mitchell, looked at me and said, "Now that's rock and roll." Thank God I amused them rather than pissed them off, or that might have been my one and only appearance on that stage. After the show, I was going to meet my girlfriend in front of the theater. As she was waiting for me, she saw a friend of hers on the way out of the theater who had just seen the show. She told her friend that she was waiting to meet her boyfriend who had just played bass in the show. The pal who had been in the audience told her, "Oh my God, did you hear what happened?" My infamy preceded me all the way to West 44th Street. Amazingly, I wasn't mortified about what had happened. I found it very odd and funny. The potential embarrassment in front of a large audience didn't bother me. By that point in my career, I'd spent so many thousands of hours in front of people that I almost didn't care anymore. Well, it wasn't that I didn't care. I always hoped to perform well. It's just that it hardly fazed me anymore. I no longer feared being on stage at the high school assembly while somehow forgetting to wear clothes that day. What I was nervous about instead was the acceptance of my fellow performers, and particularly of the music director. If I got the thumbs up from him, I would live to screw up another day. If I got the thumbs down, it was curtains for me. Thankfully, they all thought it was really funny and were glad that it had happened to me instead of one of them. They had my back for a dozen more shows over the course of the run. I loved playing that show. I did, however, learn never to wear this necklace on stage again.